Now, the recent vulnerability we saw in BricsBuilder opened up a can of worms in my mind. This made me go back very recently and look at the security that I had set up on my website. I released a video on that last week and what I've done to sort of increase the level of security and add various different levels of security in place. Check that out, links in the description. But this also brought me on to the live stream or video that was released today by Remkes de Vries alongside Calvin Olkan, who was his guest on there. Now, Calvin was the individual that actually spotted the vulnerability in BricsBuilder itself and then brought that to the attention of the Bricks team and so on. And the rest of it you kind of probably know about. And if not, don't worry too much. Just understand that the whole point here is not about that specific situation, but moving forward to make sure that when something like that arises again with whatever tools you may be using, you've got things in place to cover yourself. And that leads me on to what I want to talk about today, which is disaster recovery. Now, I've covered the whole security side of things, but in some instances, Bricks, for example, recently, doesn't matter what kind of level of firewall and things like that you had in place, that wouldn't have potentially stopped the potential for having your website hacked. I'm not going to go into details. I would recommend checking out sort of Remkes' video because that's all kind of covered there. I'll link this in the description as well. But disaster recovery is not necessarily something we think about that often. We consider putting security things in place like firewalls and having software on our websites and so on. But if the worst happens and all those things are bypassed, what's our last line of, I can't say defense, but recovery? This is where we want to talk about disaster recovery. So there are generally 3 lines of defense that I like to consider when it comes to having backups on your site. First of all, you've got your manual backup or a backup when you update plugins and so on, rollback. These are things I've covered and I covered in that previous video. Then you've got your automated backups on your website. So these are all handled on the website. The problem with either of those, though, is that if your website has already been compromised and you don't know, part of that compromising is they could easily remove your backup plugin, remove access to your backups altogether, and therefore you are kind of screwed, as it were, to put it into a technical term. So this is where the third line of defense is something you want to make sure you have in place. And there's a couple of points that I want to draw your attention to make sure you do have everything set up to give you the best possible chance of restoring your site quickly if this happens again in the future. I would recommend you take a look at the documentation or contact your hosting company to find out where the backups that are run automatically, and please tell me you've got automatic backups running as part of your hosting account, exactly where they're located. If they're on the server that your website is on, then there's the potential that they get compromised if there's a security issue on one of your sites or another person's site on that shared hosting that then allows other sites on that hosting plan to also become compromised. That is something you do not want to have happen. So ideally, what you want, and I would imagine most hosting companies are going to give you this option, maybe the cheap ones won't, but then this is where you need to contact them, is that any of those backups are actually stored on a different server, but ideally in the same location as your server. So in other words, where all your servers are located for your hosting company, that the backup server that has the backups taken off your sites are pushed over and they're in the same location. This just speeds up the whole backup and restore process because you don't have to go to different data centers around the world. So make sure, first of all, that that is in place. The second thing I would recommend is contacting your hosting company one more time and asking them, with whatever backup solution you've got in place, is there the opportunity to be able to take duplicate copies that you can have pushed over to your own cloud storage, whether you use something like pCloud, AWS, or anything like that? If you have that option, then it means that if, in the worst case scenario, something happened to that data center and everything got corrupted, you've got backups in place separate to that, which you could then restore on either the same server with your hosting company or pushed over to another hosting company in a worst case scenario to get you up and running in double quick time. Now, the next thing, and this isn't always the easiest thing to do, is to test those backups to make sure there's no corruption, because it can happen. So if you can have any kind of sort of potential method of being able to test those backups, ensure nothing gets corrupted, that's going to give you another kind of bit of peace of mind. So that's the 3 key areas that I wanted to draw your attention to. But there is still one more that I think is just as important, and that's the duration in which you keep your backups available. So what am I talking about? Let's say you only had 7 days worth of daily backups, and you found your website had been compromised, but the compromise was from 14 days ago. Well, all of your backups are compromised. so you can't roll back. And that in itself is kind of a little bit heartbreaking, especially if it's a really important site. So what do? You're going to have to rebuild it because you have no way of getting everything back, or you have to go to some kind of specialist and try to get them to clean up your website, or you've got to do it yourself, which is not a fun thing to do. Better to have 30 or ultimately 60 days worth of backups available. And that means that if something 14 days ago compromised your website, well, you can go back 15 days, 20 days, whatever you want. Restore your website, your database and everything. Yes, you probably potentially lose some information, but the reality is better that than having everything messed up. But ideally, if you've got the ability to have any of the backups you have pushed over to an external service that you control, that gives you another level of peace of mind because chances are they're not going to be compromised. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so this was a pretty short video and I didn't go into too much technical detail because every server is going to be different. Every solution you have is going to be different. But what I want to draw your attention to is how important it is to have that disaster recovery in place. And I've given you some of the most vital and most important things that you need to check and put into place on your hosting account, whether you host for yourself, whether you host for clients, reseller accounts, whatever it is. If you're not sure of any of these things I've drawn your attention to, please do make sure you contact your hosting company and they should be able to point you to the documentation or at least answer your questions to find out exactly where and what you can do. Hopefully you found this useful. If you have, please let me know in the comment section down below. And as I've said, all applicable links, including the video of Remcast, which I would 100% you do check out because it's a real eye-opener to how easy it is to have sites with vulnerabilities to be exploited without you even knowing it. So check that video out. All the links are in the description down below. My name is Paul C. This is WPTuts. Until next time, take care.